We'll be getting started here pretty soon. If you've not read Job chapter 1 through 3, you've got 2 minutes to do it. Isn't that the way it was when you go to school and you'd be like, oh boy, if I hadn't studied for that pop quiz, I better get on it now. Get your homework done. I've already seen people online that have said that they read their chapter 1 through 3. And I'll tell you, I'll give you a preview. The homework for the next lesson will be to read chapters 4 through 14, which is actually 11 chapters, but it's very, very doable. Just spend a little bit of time each day in the next week or so, and you'll be in good shape. We may not cover chapters 4 through 14, but at least you'll be prepared for that. I'm kind of preparing it in that way. That's kind of like part one of the way of looking at the book of Job in a thematic viewpoint, which that's what we've kind of done. Not read Job chapter 1 through 3. I'll turn that down now that I've got that volume on. We've still got a little bit of time. It's actually 9 o'clock exactly on the dot, but sometimes it's difficult to... Yeah, 1, 2, and 3 is what we're going to look at. I didn't. I thought about doing handouts. I did that. I made one the first week, and then I made copies of them. I left them on the copier. So then I thought, well, if I missed the first one, I'm just not going to even worry about the rest of them. That'll just be the improvement of the class 10 years from now when I reteach this for everyone. Yeah, there we go. Okay, good. I just want to make sure. Does that just seem so dark? It does, doesn't it? I don't know why that's so dark. I wonder if I can brighten it up just a little bit. I want to do... No, that didn't help. Is that better? Look a little bit better? I don't know why it's that way, but that's good. Oh, look. Hold on now. Is that getting brighter? It looks a little bit better, doesn't it? Let's see if we can get out of that now. There we go. All right, we'll just leave it there. All right. Good. Perfect. Okay. Let's turn over in the book of Job. We're going to actually get into a little bit of the text this morning, but I want to review just a little bit from what we covered last week, and the reason is because last week I was just a little bit off, and I felt like I didn't really get as passionate about as much as I wanted to about the book of Job. So I just want to spend a little bit of time kind of reviewing quickly about this book and keeping everybody up to speed on it. And then we'll jump right into the text and we'll cover, I think my plan is to cover chapters 1 through 3 this morning. Like I said, we're not covering this on a basis of verse by verse, although we'll read a lot of the text this morning. We're not going to spend a lot of time digging down super deep into each individual word. You know what I'm saying? We want to look at it more of just an overview because we're studying this from a different kind of viewpoint than a verse-by-verse study. We want to get through the book of Job in a reasonable amount of time and be able to understand it in a broad way. So we're going to study it in a thematic viewpoint. So when we study it this morning, we will be reading some of the text, but we're not going to spend an enormous amount of time in that. So first of all, I want to kind of give you just a little bit of a introductory review. The time period for the book of Job, some people have said that it is as late as the Jewish exile in Babylon, so that would be close to the 6th to 5th century. However, it describes a series of events that took place around the time of the patriarchs. Remember, we mentioned last week how there's no mention of the covenant, no mention about the law of God or anything like that, which would have made sense during the exile if that would have, been mentioned or anything like that. But it doesn't mention anything like that. So the time period is all people being enslaved in Egypt, the people of God exiting. Before Mount Sinai, before the law was given, the book of Job covers the patriarchal time. And so it's very important to see that. However, it's possible that the writing of this story could have taken place in the 6th to 5th century. Some people have thought that perhaps the story of the book of Job was something that was passed down on an oral way of communication. So it was orally passed down, and then finally someone wrote it all down. And so that's the reason why there's this big discrepancy of who wrote the book of Job and when it was written. We're just really not sure. It doesn't give us clear-cut answers about that at all. And so that's kind of an important point to bring back. So it's obviously something that is much further back than the 6th to 5th century, probably closer to the 1900 to 1800 BC is what we're looking at. Definitely a time of the Jewish patriarchs. And so when we're going through this, it's important to see what the story is, because that's what that's what we're interested in. And so the story is just really about a good man, a righteous man. The Bible, we're going to read in a minute, it describes him as a man who was blameless. That's what my version says in verse 1, that Job was blameless. And so it's about a good man who suffers great calamity, really suffers through something that's just absolutely terrible. Great loss happens in Job's life. And the point is that it's to no fault of his own. A lot of times when we see something that someone goes through, we say, well, they made bad choices, or, those things happened because he did this or did that. But what we see, and this is so important for us to understand the whole concept of the book of Job, we see it from a broader view than Job sees it. Job doesn't know that there has been a conversation between Satan and God about Job's righteousness. So when all these things happen to Job, Job says, I don't know why. And the time period that Job is in, people believe that things that happen to you on a good basis were because you were a good person. You were a blameless person. If bad things happen to you, it's because you must have done something wrong. And I think even Job struggles with that in his own life. And his friends certainly ascribe to that kind of mind thought. So here he goes through a terrible thing, but it's to no fault of his own. But he doesn't understand that. That's the dilemma. That's the thing that he's wrestling with in his own mind. We look back at it and go, wow, we know why he's going through this. We can see the broader picture. And that is the message for us today, too, is that whatever is happening in your life, you have things that you can control and things that you can't control. And that's a great counseling technique right there, to think about those things and distinguish those things between things you can do something about and things that you can't do anything about. And then those things that you can't do anything about, you throw those things away. But those things that you can control, you work harder to control those things. That's a great counseling technique. And so we kind of get that picture when we look at the book of Job and realize what he's going through. He's going through something that is of no fault of his own, but he doesn't know that. He doesn't understand that. So when we go through it, we'll see that. Now, we've talked about the main characters already, that there's God and Satan. And I want you to notice that they're always in pairs, because throughout the book of Job, you just see these dialogues and monologues throughout it. And so it's kind of interesting to see that these characters are there, and you could pair them up with somebody else. So you've got, first of all, God and Satan. That's how the story kind of begins, this dialogue between them. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit. And then you've got Job and his wife, another main characters, although Job's wife is just a brief little blip in the whole grand scheme of the story. And then you've got his four friends, three of which that begin, and then the fourth friend, Elihu, becomes more vocal at the very end, and one of the younger of the friends, and he gives him some advice as well. So that's the main characters that we have. And then we look at just this plot. Now the plot mainly is comprised of a series of 7 dialogues and monologues that move the story along. Okay, so let's look at it and begin here. We've got this first prologue, which we'll read this morning, and then we've got this dialogue between God and the devil, and that happens 2 times. Okay, we'll see it happen, and then they come back to it again, and they have this dialogue all over again. Then you've got a dialogue between Job and his wife. I want to make sure I'm keeping up here. A dialogue between Job and his wife. And then you have a dialogue between Job and his friends. Okay? And then you have a monologue with this young man, Elihu. And then again, you have another dialogue between God and Job, or not another one, but you've got 2 different occasions of God and Job having this dialogue between the 2 of them. Then you conclude with just the epilogue. It begins to close out the story. And that's where it's so funny, because at the very beginning of the book of Job, you have this different style of writing. It's just telling you the story of what's happening. And then you've got the middle part of the book of Job that is all this poetry. And it can be difficult to read. If we didn't have the prologue and the epilogue, you would look at this poetry and go, I don't understand anything that's happening right here. The majority of the book is this poetry that's right there in the middle of it. But because we have the story at the very beginning and then the story at the very end, we go, oh, now I can piece it all together and it makes sense to me. So that's very, very beneficial for us. So these 7 sections introduce the character of Job, the setting of his life, the crisis in which he has to go through, how he handled it, how he interpreted it, and then how it is finally resolved in a way. Part of it's resolved. At least we understand that Job gets the things back that he had lost, double the amount, but it's never resolved to Job of why he went through what he went through. He's never told at the very end of the book, hey, Job, everything you went through is because me and Satan had this conversation and I allowed these things to happen. Job never finds that out. He never finds that out. So there is a sense of resolution, because everything is placed back to the way that it was, except he still remembers that loss, but he's never told in the sense of resolution of why he went through what he went through. So in some aspects there is some resolution. And so we, as we go through this, we have, kind of looked at a couple of outlines last week to kind of help us see what this story is about. And these outlines, they serve all kinds of different purposes. You know, if you were to look at more of a formal outline of the book of Job, you're going to go through every single verse. Every part of the outline is accounted for in the book, and you're going to look at the events in a chronological order, and it focuses on knowing the story as a progression and knowing those characters. And the whole goal of that kind of approach to this study is so that you're familiar with the book of Job. You know it. And you could go and tell your friends all about the book of Job. But then we have what we talked about last week was this compressed outline. And the compressed outline is where it simply just tells us exactly the progression of it in a simple way of understanding and remembering it. Okay? So we have Job's distress, everything he went through in chapters 1 through 3. Job's defense, chapters 4 through 37. And then you have Job's deliverance, 38 through 42. So that's really helpful for us to see and understand. And the whole goal of this is to summarize that story in a meaningful way that's easily remembered. we're not doing these two ways of looking at it. We're not doing a formal outline, and we're not looking at it as a compressed outline. We're looking at the book of Job in a thematic outline, okay? And the thematic outline that we are using is one of crisis management. So that's the theme of our class, crisis management, which I think is very appropriate for us today. Okay? I think it's very appropriate for us to look at this as crisis management. So here we'll try to understand what the story is teaching us with these very specific religious theological principles that are found in the book. Okay? The goal for us to see what the story means, not just what the story is. That's your formal outline. You know the story. But the thematic outline says, now I know it, but I also know what it's teaching me. I know what it means, and I know how it applies into my life. That's what I want us to learn from the book of Job. And that will be what our approach is for the next several weeks. So this thematic outline deals with the physical crisis, and that's what we'll cover this morning. And then we will look at the theological crisis. And then we will look at the spiritual crisis that Job went through. And we'll spend a lot more time in the theological crisis, obviously, because that's the bulk of the book anyway. But this morning, I think we can get through the physical crisis in one class. Okay, so one thing that I think is so important for us to think about for just a moment as we're getting into what this whole book is about and what this means for us is to look at this as, how do I apply this? How does this make sense to me? How do I manage a crisis in my own life faithfully, the way that Job did? How do I be like Job? Well, we all have different kinds of crises in our life. Is that the right way of saying crises? Is that the right way if it's plural? Okay, we'll make sure. It's spelled the same, though, isn't it? Just E-S? Okay. Sorry, commercial break on the word crisis. So, anyway, we all have different crises that we go through, okay? You may say, well, I'm going through a job loss. This is a crisis for me. Some of you may say, well, I'm going through the death of a family member, and that's my crisis right now. Some of you may say, well, we're in a crisis or stressful situation financially, and that's certainly one that people are dealing with today and have always dealt with. Then you have crises from, maybe we're moving a long distance away, and that's a crisis situation for us because it causes an enormous amount of stress on people. Well, here we are, and we're living through a crisis right now in our world with the threat of this COVID-19 virus, the threat of economic disaster, the threat of political disaster. I mean, all of that. We are in a crisis, and we all are sitting there going, how do we manage this crisis faithfully? All of the crises should be managed faithfully. We know that. That's easy. I didn't even have to teach you that. Y'all already knew that you're supposed to be faithful no matter what you're facing in life. But how we do it may be a little bit different depending on that kind of crisis that you specifically are going through. So it's very important for us to remember as we're going through it. So I put this up here. Sometimes, though, we are more interested in the crisis part more than the faithful part. It's so easy for us to look at everything that, just happened to Job, the disaster, the turmoil, and just really just want to look and watch. It's this difficult situation, and our natural curiosity turns our head to where we would rather look at the drama that's going around Job and maybe even our own lives, the terrible things that are going on in his life. It's like a car wreck. When you drive by a car wreck, you know you do it, don't you? You turn, you look, you watch, you see. You want to see the damage. You want to see maybe how many cars are involved. Oh, I wonder what's going on up there. Boy, look at all the lights. Look at the police officers. Look at the ambulance. Look at the fire trucks that are there. Look at all the cleanup they're having to do. Does anybody see any blood? We maybe can go that dramatic and that, trauma is going on, and we may even go to that far where we will turn our heads. You know what you end up doing? First of all, you're slowing down traffic. That's obviously the case. But you could also cause a wreck for somebody else, or even cause a wreck for yourself, and it causes more disaster. We sometimes are more interested in what's going on and the drama around that than the actual being faithful and staying focused and are on the road ourselves. That's what we do. And that's a natural way. It's not right, but it is a natural way of doing it. We look at that. And I think when we approach the book of Job, we say, oh, look at the damage. Look at all the things that he lost. Oh, it's so terrible. Oh, Job, he went through such a terrible thing. He really was hurting. Emotionally, he's hurting. Physically, he's hurting. Financially, Job is hurting. You know, socially, he's hurting. And we concentrate on everything that he lost, and we forgot to really look at the fact that he was faithful. He was faithful. So in the story of Job, there's a lot of these tragic events. And we tend to look at that and forget to be looking at how faithful and good that Job was. So it's important to do that and remember that. Here's another point that I think is important. The main points are right here in the very middle of it before we get into the text. Because I'm expecting that you all did your homework and read chapters 1 through 3. So y'all know it. And when we get into it, y'all will be that much ahead. So one thing to keep in mind, however, is that we're observing how Job maintains a measure of faith. It is not perfect faith. A lot of times we look at Job and think, man, he is the perfect example of faith. No, Jesus is. Jesus is the perfect example of faith. Job's good, but Job was just one that maintained his faith. And that's a great example for us to look at. I want to maintain my faith, but you know what? My faith does this. I'm probably the only one in this room that experiences this. My faith goes really good, and I'm doing fantastic. I'm reading the Bible, I'm praying the way I should, and then something happens in my life, and my faith starts doing this. And then maybe I get a little bit stronger, and people encourage me and pat me on the back and tell me I can do it, and I come up, but then my faith comes back down. And then I go up, and then I go down. And that's, I think, a natural way of doing it. I think I'm not saying it's right. I want to always be growing in my faith. I wish it was always on the upward trend, but it's not. But if, in my human mind, I can maintain my faith and say, I'm going to be faithful unto death, and I can receive a crown of life. I'm not going to be perfect, and I'm not always going to be growing. If I just make it, then I'll be good. That's Job. Job was one. He did not have perfect faith. He wavered. And we'll see that in the text this morning. We'll see him wavering. But yet he still maintained his faith all the way through the book and the story and everything that he went through. All right, so when we study Job, we're examining this particular man's experience of faith and not necessarily how ideal of a faith that someone would express. And even if Job's belief and grasp of faithfulness was remarkable, he was not perfect. And so don't look down on Job, though. Job did not have the book of the law to read through and say, oh, look, now I know what I need to do. He didn't have the law of Moses. Job didn't have the prophets for them to preach to him and to warn him of his behavior. Job didn't have that. Job did not have the model life of Jesus to look to and the example that he set on how to deal with adversity and be faithful to God. He didn't have that. He didn't have the Gospels to turn over to and the letters of Paul to reference to see how to live a good, faithful life to God. He didn't have that. And so we don't want to be too harsh on Job or anything like that, but just realize that Job was one that just maintained his faith. He was not perfect at all. So when we get into these first few verses this morning of this book, I forgot to advance that one over to that one. That's okay. When we get through that, we'll see what kind of man that Job was and the faith that he managed, which should, boy, I'm hoping it does. I hope that it encourages you to be somebody who manages their faith even in the face of a crisis. Yes, sir.
I know a
Well, that's all. I don't know. I think that's connected. I have a hard time, LB, saying that this is my spiritual health can be here, but my mental health can be here. A lot of times, boy, they're neck and neck. I don't know. That's me personally. I'm not a psychiatrist, and I don't know that. I just know in my personal life, if my spiritual life is going well, then my mental life is probably right on par too. And if my spiritual life is going down, well, then mentally I'm struggling. I don't know if it's ever like that. Maybe, but me personally, you may have your own experience with that, but that's just me, LB. I don't know. All right, let's read a little bit of the text. So turn over to Job chapter 1 if you're not already there, and we're going to read it together. It says, "There was a certain man of the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men in the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day. And they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them when the days of feasting had completed their cycle. Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, 'Perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts.' Thus Job did continually." All right, so let's talk a little bit about the man Job. That's how it begins. It just tells us about the man Job. And I want you to notice this one little thing I think is interesting. A lot of times in the Old Testament, there's a few exceptions, but a lot of times in the Old Testament, when a character or a man or a woman is introduced, you'll see the lineage of that person. You'll see their genealogy. You'll see where they came from. Not with Job. It just starts with Job. Job was this. And that's it. We don't know really anything about where he came from or anything like that. It just says, there was this man. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And it just starts that way. And I think that's interesting that you see that with Job. I would love to have known a little bit more about his history, but we don't see that here. So let's talk a little bit about what we do read in this text, okay? So in these first few short verses, we learn that Job was what? Blameless and upright, first of all. He's blameless and upright. His mind and his heart were straight and correct, and he worked on his moral conduct. I read one commentary this week that said, Job... let me think what it said. Job loves what Yahweh loves and hates what Yahweh hates. Oh, I liked that. It's simple. To love what God loves. To hate what God hates. That's a great thing for us to be aspiring to be. And if you're blameless, if you're like Job, that's what you are. You are someone who loves what God loves and you hate what God hates. Job was also, it describes him as that he feared God. He had a continual reverence for God, which served his motivation for justice and truth and efforts as personal goodness. It says that he avoided evil. He was a man who steered away from it. He had no fascination, no attraction, or curiosity for things that are evil. And I just keep thinking, perhaps old Job, if he saw something that was ugly or anything, he was one that would turn away from it. He avoided every aspect of it. I'm not going to waste my time on those things. I'm going to steer away from it. That's who Job is. He's going to stay away from those kinds of things. There's a lot of trash out there, isn't there? You think about, I don't know what the percentage of 90% or whatever, probably more than that, of the things that are on the internet is trash. Well, if Job, he sees something like that, he's going to click off of it. He's going to stay away from it. He is avoiding all kinds of things that are evil. He doesn't want those things to influence his mind. And he's avoided it. That's what Job needed to do. He needed to be somebody that says, I'm shunning away from that. Every appearance of that or ungodly people or ungodly things, he steered away from. It also says that he had a very large family. 7 sons, 3 daughters. That's 10 kids. His wife is not mentioned in this verse or anything like that. I think that's interesting of all the things that could be written about her. And, the Bible could have easily said and he had a wife, and her name was Mrs. Job, and, they had 10 kids together. It doesn't even give us that. And that may be somewhat of a clue to her reaction that we find here later on. Job was a businessman. We learn that he had a lot of possessions, great wealth. He invested in camels, which camels of that day, you didn't have camels for fun. You had camels for a business opportunity. When you've got this many camels, 3,000 camels, he's probably investing in transportation, the shipping of goods, those kinds of things. For maybe food and clothing, maybe that was another part of his business. He had 7,000 sheep. No one keeps sheep, that many of them, just as a hobby. Okay, he's a businessman, and he maybe sells the sheep and provides clothing with the wool and food. Maybe that's what he's in. He's certainly a part in the business of farming. He's got 500 yoke of oxen. And a yoke of oxen is actually 2, so that's 1,000 ox I guess. 1,000 oxen that he used production of milk, personal transportation. He had 500 donkeys. Some people don't even want one donkey, okay? Job's got 500 of these. He is a businessman, is who he is. And we kind of see this, indication later on that he is esteemed by all of the people around him, his peers. He's a very successful person. It says here that he had many servants. That was another thing that's interesting. It kind of shows that he is very wealthy and maybe a businessman. Large households would have servants who worked the land, animals, business ventures, whatever they did. They worked for him and with him and managed and cared for his estate. He was high honored by his peers. Aside from his personal wealth, he was looked on by his countrymen as someone who was very successful. He was a great man among them. I think this may be reading a little bit into it, but I think he had a very close-knit family. Job's family maintained a close-knit relationship, a loving attitude among themselves. Unlike many rich families, there's a lot of maybe jealousy and competition between siblings and that kind of thing. It seems like Job's family, they got together at least for their birthdays. That's when it says they got together for feast for their days in the text. Probably they celebrated the day they were born, so they'd get together, and that's a close-knit family, They're right there together. And when Job loses all of that, he's truly hurt, He doesn't like that at all. And so he has a good close-knit family, for sure. He was pious, okay? He was very pious, which means that he's very religious. Finally, in contrast to the personal wealth and the power, we see Job very carefully offering sacrifices to God, not just for himself, obviously, but even for his children. In the case that through their youthful experiences or inexperience or their ignorance or whatever it is, they may have neglected to pay homage to God in the way that they should, in a reverent way. And so he offers sacrifice for them. And so another indication, I think, that he's close with his kids. They worshiped together, as a good way of maybe looking at it. Well, this introduction into who the man Job is, among other things, gives us exactly a picture of who this man was and how he was really the least likely to be the target of the wrath of God. Since at that time, Job and his peers and the people around him believed that Job's blessing were a physical sign, something you could see, that he was a righteous man. And that's what they thought. Look at Job. Well, he must be doing something right with God because he is blessed. He is so successful in his business. And so we have this theological question that comes up. Is it true that good men are blessed? Is it true? Well, that's true. Good men are blessed. It doesn't mean that good men are always blessed or that they're always blessed physically. But good men are blessed. That's what they thought. That's what they thought, that if you had good things, then it may be because you are a good person. Another thing is that the way of sinners is hard. That's another theological statement that I think is important to think about. The way of sinners is hard. In other words, good men are going to prosper, they're going to do well, and evil men will be cursed in this life. And the thing is in the book of Job, when this is being discussed and when this is being written and when this is happening in Job's life, they thought that those things would happen in real time. If you were good, you got immediate blessings. If you were bad, if you were ugly, if you were wicked, then you got immediate wrath and punishment. And it was done in real time. Now, we look back at this, we kind of have a different view of that, I think, in our society. We say, well, and somewhat we do. Sometimes we say, boy, look at how successful they are. They must be doing something right. They must be doing something right. And we, in our culture, which it trickles down from the Buddhist and from the Hindu viewpoint of karma, it is certainly a part of our culture. We'll look at that and say, well, they must be doing something right because, what comes around goes around. That's what we say, right? We'll say that. What comes around goes around. And that can be used in a negative way. Well, look, they've really messed up. And you know what? You're going to deal with the punishment of that. And I can see it right now in real time. Or we'll say, boy, look how good they are. Look, God is blessing them right now. And that happens. I believe it. But it's not always the case. Someone can live a righteous life their whole life and never really be successful right now in this life. We see that too, don't we? That's just the way life is. We have that view. In Job's time, they thought it was in real time, right then, that someone would suffer because they've done something wrong, or someone would be prosperous because they've been doing something right. That's the battle Job's having to face right now. That's the battle and the argument of all of his friends. They'll come to him and they'll say, what have you done? You've done something wrong. What have you done? You must have done something wrong for you to have to suffer this way. Well, let's keep reading a little bit in our text, okay? There's the pious part. He's pious. Let's keep reading. Starting in verse 6, it says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from roaming about the earth and walking around on it. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. Then Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands and his possessions and have increased in the land, but put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And then the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. So we sit there and we think, well, what is the reason for this suffering? Here's what we learn from this text. The reason that Job suffered is because there's this conversation between God and Satan. And what happens is that God allows Satan to test the integrity of Job's faith. He allows Satan to test his integrity. And so that's a difficult thing to understand. Satan claims that Job's good character is based on many blessings. And if he'll just take some of those things away and be removed from those things, then Job will turn his worship into cursing God. He'll turn his righteousness into unrighteousness. You take all those things away from him. And the key here is that not only are God and Satan aware of the true cause behind the trials that are raining down upon Job, we are too. You get to see this. We're looking at it. Remember? We're looking at it. We're the readers, and Job doesn't know. Job's wife doesn't know. His kids don't know everything that's going on. But we do. His friends are out of the loop, but Job understands it. Yes, sir. One of the most frightening ones. Verse 7. Yeah. The Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about the earth and walking around on it." It is scary, isn't it? Because the New Testament teaches us that Satan still does that today. He still does that today. Peter describes the devil as a roaring, lying, seeking whom he may devour. That's a scary one there too. Very scary. Yeah, it's a good point. Yep. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind that he sees that that Job doesn't see everything that's going on, but we do see that very thing. So Satan claims that Job's good character is based upon his many blessings. Based upon his many blessings. All right? Let's talk a little bit about Job's suffering and his loss for just a moment. He loses his property and his children, verses 13 through 19. Have we already read that one, 13 through 19? I guess not. We didn't read that part. That's okay. Y'all have already read that part, so I'm just going to go through it. So we understand that he loses his property and his children, and it's interesting because the loss is due to people. The Sabians, a desert tribe, come and they steal his oxen. Then you have a loss by nature. Lightning come, and he loses servants and he loses sheep. Then you have the loss due to people. The Chaldeans come and they take his camels and his servants. And then again you have loss by nature, where a wind or a tornado comes and kills his family. Oh, look, I put that up there. Good. That's fantastic. So you see this pattern? That's a pattern to me. People, nature, people, nature. Okay? I love the way the Bible is written, because that's what we see. People, nature, nature. Don't you think that still happens today? I don't see any. The pattern has not changed. When crisis happens, it's probably due to these two things. People are involved, or just nature is involved. And that's very important for us to remember. What does Job do? He passes the initial test. He passes the initial test. Let's read verses 20 through 22 real quick. It says, "Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and he worshipped. And he said, 'Naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.' Through all of this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God." Not at all. Let's see, I thought I put that up there. Good. So what is Job's response? Well, he does not curse or blame God in all this. That's what the text tells us. He does not curse God or blame him in any way. Instead, he praises God. That's what he does. He does not feel sorry for himself in any way. Doesn't feel sorry for himself. That's what I would be doing. I'd be saying, well, but look at all this stuff I've lost. Oh, I'm so depressed. That's me. Oh, I'd be feeling sorry for myself. He does not lose faith at all. He doesn't lose faith. He doesn't curse. He doesn't blame God. He praises him instead. And I think that's beautiful. Let's keep looking on this. The last part is he turns to God. He turns to God instead. He turns to him. Boy, what a great response. That's the response that we should all have. We're faced with that kind of calamity. We turn to God instead. That's a good point. All right, so Job's response is good. He does very well. This is Job's finest hour, and that he suffers this great loss. Chapter 2 begins, and I'm going to, I guess we'll read a little bit here and maybe talk a little bit about it. It says, "Again there was a day when the sons of God," you see here's, again, another dialogue between God and Satan. Okay, so this is dialogue number 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" And Satan answered, the Lord said, "From roaming about." Have I already read this? No. It's repeated. Okay, good. I just want to make sure. I think, well, we've already talked about it. The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, although you enticed me against him to ruin him without cause." There's the difference. That last line is the difference between those two dialogues. It's interesting to note that in ancient writings, you would see the repetition. The story is told twice to bring that emphasis to it. The only difference between what we read in chapter 1 and chapter 2 is you enticed me against him to ruin him without cause. In other words, God's not saying, "Hey, you made me do this," but you said, "Hey, let's try this. Let's try this." Satan says, "You've put a protection around Job. Take that protection away and see what he does." So God says, "Okay, well, fine. I'll do that. I'll do that." He enticed him to do that without cause. Okay, so then it says, "And Satan answered the Lord, 'Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." There it is again, to your face. It's almost so ugly sounding, isn't it? Ugh. So the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your power. Only spare his life." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself while sitting among the ashes, or the garbage is another way of looking at it. He's sitting there in the garbage. Okay, so we're going to stop here pretty soon. I want to get through just this little bit of Satan's attack, and then we'll stop. Here we have where Satan has another round of it. Okay, so he's taken all of his children, he's taken all this livestock, and just taken just about everything away from him, except Job still has his health. And he says, "You know what? You remove that part of it, and he'll curse you again. He'll curse you again." And God says, "Okay, well, fine. You can do everything, just you can't take his life." And so Satan comes and he allows that, he puts those boils upon his head. And that's disgusting to me to think about. I hate that. I hate, even on my own body, if I get a pimple on my body, I hate that. I'm 40 years old, I still get pimples. Is that normal? I don't know. But I hate when that happens, So imagine these sores and these boils all over you, and you have to take this pottery, and you're just so miserable. You're scraping it off, and he's sitting among the ashes, the garbage, this trash heap, because that's just where he would be, as if he was a beggar. And he's miserable in this situation. But up to this point, he's had his health. And so this illness comes over all of his body, and this skin disease is there. Not necessarily leprosy. That's an important thing to kind of point out. It doesn't say leprosy. It just says boils are there. Okay? All right. Well, let's stop right there with chapter 2, verse 9, and we'll pick that back up and keep reading a little bit. Okay? Thank you very much.